Welcome to Saturday Night at the Movies, the podcast that celebrates classic, cult, and current films and the people that made them, and many other aspects of pop culture. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer's Ben Shrewsbury, and our signature theme was composed by Greg Lehrhoff. Here it's always Saturday night, and our mission is to chronicle film and pop cultural history one memory at a time. Tonight, I am so happy to introduce a gentleman for whom I worked for nearly 10 years. The former president of programming for Showtime, who during that period greenlit more movies than any studio executive in Hollywood, a former lawyer, producer, philanthropist, and friend to all independent filmmakers, Mr. Jerry Offsay. Welcome to the show, Jerry.
Thanks for that lovely introduction, Steve. It's really nice to see you there. It's looks like almost no time has gone by since we first met 30 years ago, although one of us has gotten a little gray.
Yes, a little bit. Um, I think of you as such a movie guy who just loves movies, all aspects of movies. I want to go back to when you were a little boy. Did you grow up in a family that you would say embraced movie culture? Were you at the movies a lot?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that's probably where it all started. We lived in the Bronx, but my parents loved to go out in Manhattan on the weekends, and so I would say that Saturday was their date night, and Sunday was family date night, and we probably drove in one or two times a month to see something in the big theaters in Manhattan. And the other Sundays, we probably went to the movies right at the Lowe's American in Parkchester. And so I went to the movies almost weekly as a kid. And that doesn't count the times I went to the movies with my friends in the afternoon when it cost 50 cents for kids to get into a matinee. And those, those draconian matrons would police the aisles with their flashlights if anybody made a sound during the show. So yeah, I am a movie buff from birth.
I remember doing the same thing. I remember a kid throwing one of those giant suckers at the screen and it stuck. So I had to watch a movie through this giant sucker that was slowly making itself down. Do you remember some movies from your youth that stand out for you that impressed you?
Well, I remember very well The Carpetbaggers, which I saw with my parents on a Saturday night because, in hindsight, the subject matter was absolutely inappropriate for my, I think, probably 8 or 9 year old self and my sister, who was 22 months younger. But, I was kind of a pudgy kid, and my mother was always taking food out of my mouth. And The Carpetbaggers is one of the few movies I ever got to see where my mother was encouraging me to go out to the candy stand every 20 minutes. Generally, I think that probably was when Carol Baker was taking her clothes off or something. So that one stands out very well. I remember a double feature that I went to with my sister and brother-in-law, which was a crazy double feature. It was a movie called Sunrise at Campobello, which was about FDR, and No Time for Sergeants, which was a goofy, military comedy. And who it was that was the programmer that paired up this double feature, I don't know, but we saw both ends, and I'm not sure. I was a big reader as a kid as well, and I read biographies. So I had actually read a biography of Franklin Delano Roosevelt before I saw that movie. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had any interest probably or a clue. But No Time for Sergeants was funny and enjoyable.
By
And
the way,
I mean, there's
just for grins, I had it on last night.
oh
I
my
was surfing.
God.
I was surfing TCM. It's kind of a guilty pleasure favorite of mine because the repartee between Andy Griffith and Nick Adams is just so goofy and funny. And you have Myron McCormick and Murray Hamilton just chewing the scenery in the background. Just funny stuff.
Yeah, no, that was a classic. And I think, you know some of the most memorable ones. I saw Ben-Hur. I was too young for when it first came out, but like 3 years later, they had a re-release, and it was in a giant theater downtown. And my sister and brother-in-law took me. I must have been like 8 or 9, and on that giant screen, seeing the chariot races was just like, it scared the hell out of me, quite frankly. I mean, it was, so real and so loud and so pulse pounding that, so that's another early memory. And then, I'll just mention two others because they actually relate to Showtime, interestingly. So one movie that I saw twice straight through was Easy Rider. Um, as a kid, we went to the Circle Theater, right under the L in the Bronx, and my friends and I, and we saw the movie twice. And I was a big music fan also. And as Peter Fonda said to me when we worked together, um, he took he took the albums off his shelf and he used them to fill in the music that he wanted, and he then worried about getting the rights afterwards. Um, but uh, one of the movies that I didn't get done at Showtime and that I actually have tried a little bit lately was Uneasy Riders, where Peter was going to do the story of the making of the movie and what his relationship with Dennis Hopper was. And we had greenlit that movie at Showtime, and Peter was going to direct it. And one day he called me up and said that he needed to go to lunch with me, and we went. And he said he's decided that he was too young to die, and that Dennis would kill him if he were to make this movie that's in that script, his version of it, which showed what a maniac Dennis was during the making of that film. And so both Dennis and Peter are gone now. And I have the script, and I actually sent it out to Paramount a few months ago to our old friend Dan Cohn over there, and they were intrigued, but didn't say yes. So someday I may still get that movie made. It would be great. We did two movies with Peter, and he was nominated for the Golden Globe and Passion of Ayn Rand, and then he helped Selma Hayek get her directing debut by starring in her little movie that she directed for us. And I had a very lovely relationship with Peter. And so I would like to get his story of what happened to him during the making of that movie made. The other one, it was Midnight Cowboy, which I guess I was 15 when that came out. And my parents took my sister and I to see Midnight Cowboy. And it was very, very awkward. I'm not sure I knew what being gay was when I went into that theater. I certainly had a better understanding when I came out. But I had the pleasure of working both with John Voight and Dustin Hoffman at Showtime, and we gave Dustin and John both actually their directing debuts. John did a feature for us called Tin Soldier, one of the family movies, and Dustin did a short. And John was in the office talking about something, and Carol, my assistant, came in and said, "I hate to interrupt you, but Dustin Hoffman's on the phone. He's got a question about, the thing that he's directing. What he actually wanted was an extra day to shoot, which I agreed to. And I got them to get on the phone with each other. Even though I think, I don't know if it was personality or politics. Their politics are vastly different from each other that drove them apart. So, one other time, John said to me he hadn't spoken to Dustin in 20 or 25 years or something at that point in time. But, they were both friends of Showtime. We worked with John a lot, and Dustin produced The Devil's Arithmetic for us, in addition to him doing that short and introduced it on the air. But I remember thinking then that I wish my parents were alive so that I could call them up and say, you would not in your wildest dreams believe what I did today and what happened in my office today. And really, that wasn't the only time I had that feeling of I couldn't believe myself what was happening and the people I was working with and the people I had admired their talent growing up and who were now I was in business with, I was making films with. It was, my assistant Carol, who was a very tough, I'm sure you remember Carol if you've
Oh,
ever
she
met her.
Carol was a female drill sergeant.
Exactly, and an unforgettable character if ever there was one. But I told Carol when she took the job that if I ever complained too much about it, if it looked like I forgot how lucky I was to have this job, that she had carte blanche to kick me in the ass. And there were times when there were some rough patches in a 10-year period. Who doesn't have that? Where I was feeling put upon or whatever it is. Where she said, "Shut up, or you're going to get that kick in the ass." So,
Well, 2 years before you got to Showtime, I got hired to do some unit publicity work. And Showtime in '92 was definitely the Avis to HBO's Hertz, but I think that in terms of its movie output, it was mostly late night thrillers that I would consider mostly to be B movies. I mean, the movies I were working on were competent, but nothing really stood out. And then I would like to know how you got to Showtime. What was the route? Because I know you had been an executive with RKO Pictures. You had produced some movies like Eight Men Out and Hamburger Hill. But how did you get to Showtime, Jerry?
well, from the age of 10, almost certainly inspired by To Kill a Mockingbird and the Defenders, I knew I was going to be a lawyer, and I went all through college. In college, I booked concerts, I booked speakers. I had Gene Shepard told the story, A Christmas Story, at a speaking engagement in SUNY Binghamton, in Binghamton, New York, years before the movie came out. I heard that story before, probably, I and the people who were there heard it before anybody got to hear it, before he'd done it on his radio show. So I had my toe in the business a little bit, even in college. And I saw 2 or 3 movies a week in college. And I read 2 or 3 novels a week in college, in addition to, I majored in history, political science, and minored in English. So I got a major in the first two, and I still ended up taking 7 literature classes. Um, and that's all that I was interested in, other than, the Yankees and the like. All I was interested in were movies and books, but I knew I was going to be a lawyer. And when I got to law school, there was I thought that what I wanted to do was do good in the world. And I wanted to work for Ralph Nader, and I wanted to be a crusader against, corporate abuses. And in my first year in law school, the Supreme Court came down with a ruling that pretty much put um, the kind of what they call private attorney general cases out of business, which is if Alcoa had polluted Lake Michigan and it was too expensive for any one homeowner to, complain about it, but they could band together into a class action, and they could hire competent lawyers who could then sue Alcoa. And now that can be done again, but for a brief period of time, those things were, without getting into the weeds on that, it basically became impossible to do that. So there I am sitting in law school, and I didn't want to make no money. I had not had a very, I had a middle class upbringing, but my parents were always stretching a dollar and worrying about money. And my dad worked, I remember a period where he worked 7 days a week for like 9 or 10 months in a row in his business. It was his own business, and he had 3 or 4 guys working for him. They did point of purchase display models. So, whether it was legs pantyhose, where people have seen that shell where the pantyhose come in there. Well, my dad designed the that container and the display that it would stand in a 7-Eleven or in a Macy's or whatever. He made the original prototypes for those things, but the big money was in the mass production of them. And he would design it for a company who was in the mass production business, and they would sell it to Legs or to Revlon for displaying lipsticks on the counter. Or and so they struggled, and I wanted to make money, but I wanted to also do good. And I was stymied by the fact of this court um, case. And a friend of mine who was a year ahead of me at law school at Columbia said to me, well, I'm going out to California this summer to work, and I'm going to work for the firm that represents Johnny Carson and Barbra Streisand and the Rolling Stones. And, there are people who are lawyers for musicians and for actors and whatever. And I was very naive. I was 21, and I said, there are? Well, I never interviewed for a job as a lawyer except to be an entertainment lawyer. And I got very lucky uh, in the summer after my second year in law school to go to work at a firm called Loeb and Loeb, which was the original entertainment law firm. The Loeb brothers left one of the big established law firms back in the 30s to set up their own shop, because Hollywood was kind of a dirty word for the established uh, law firms. And being Jewish, they were kind of outsiders in those firms. And the firms, but they were developing a clientele amongst the people who founded the studios. And the big law firm that they were at really didn't want that business. Hollywood was considered, kind of shady, or, not proper. They didn't want to deal with actors and producers. And so the Lobes went out and founded this law firm, and, which is now about 120 years old. So I guess they left even earlier than that. And when I went to work at Loeb and Loeb, we represented Stanley Kubrick, we represented Diana Ross, we represented John Wayne, we represented the Rams, we represented, Berry Gordy and Motown, but we also represented Stevie Wonder. And we had to get a conflict letters for that, but and Walter Matthau was a client, and Richard Widmark was a client, and my senior partner, Louis Blau, represented, Toffler and Truffaut, and Toffler and Truffaut at one end, and Danielle Steele and Bill Bixby at the other. And
Do you remember the first client that you had any interaction with in celebrity, world?
well, I got a call one day from at 8 o'clock in the morning. Obviously, my senior partner, Mickey Slobodian, who represented John Wayne, had given him my number. He was going to do a guest shot on The Tonight Show. He ultimately never made that. He was already sick with cancer at the time, but I picked up the phone, and there was that unmistakable voice to, had I made the arrangements for his limo to pick him up, and did they know what it is that he liked to drink, and were they sending the usual limo driver who drove him to wherever other places he went, and that was quite a way to start your day. At the time, I was 23, and already out of law school and working there. And in the music area, I mean, I said that we represented Diana and Stevie Wonder. Diana Ross made me lunch in her bungalow when uh, because she wanted to do the Josephine Baker story. And she was so passionate to do it that she was going to hire and pay for the writer to do the script herself. And she hired Jack Briley right after he had won the Oscar for Gandhi. And I negotiated that deal, and it was almost done. And she wanted an update on the deal, and the senior partner who represented her was away. And I'd met her a couple of times, and she said, "Well, come and have lunch at the Beverly Hills Hotel." And when I got there, and I went into the Polo Lounge and said, "I'm meeting Miss Diana Ross," they said, "Oh, she said you should come to her bungalow." So I did. Fortunately, she had from a culinary point of view, she had limited um, items there. She actually made me a cheese sandwich, and I kept looking at those. Diana has the most magnificent nails, that you could ever imagine, and her trying to like peel the slices apart while she was making this sandwich. And I think she had fruit for lunch or something. And she had this giant basket of, like every fruit you'd ever seen sitting on the coffee table. Um, so yeah, I have a music feed that I made, and one of the first things when I was sick about 5 years ago, my kids bought me some Bose headphones and got me a subscription to Spotify, and it has 10 that Spotify. I'm sure you don't know this, but they have a 10,000 song limit on any one feed. I know that because I hit that limit about 2 years ago.
Oh my
They
God.
will let you download more songs. You just have to have a new feed. So my feed is called Woodstock because I got those headphones on my 65th birthday, but I had been to a birthday party earlier in the day, a 70th birthday party for a guy named Spencer Proffer, who was the quarterback of the music that we did in our Showtime films. He was the music producer, executive music producer on 65 of our films. And one of the things he did was bring us for our movie The Wall, um, Graham Nash, to do a theme song called The Wall. And Pam and I went to the studio to watch Graham record it. Graham happened to live 3 houses away from me in Encino, so I knew him, as a neighbor, but I had not had the privilege of working with him. And all these years after that, he was at Spencer's 70th birthday party, and he sang 3 songs. And he sang Woodstock and Teach My Children. So then I went home later that day to have a birthday party with my kids, and they showed me how to do this. They said, "What song do you want to be the first song downloaded?" And I had been at Woodstock. I didn't see Crosby, Stills, and Nash. I was just there for an evening and went home. And so I said, "Woodstock, I want that to be the first song." So my feed is called Woodstock, and it has 10,000 songs on it. And a lot of the after I downloaded the obvious, Bruce Springsteen and the Cream and the Crosby, Stills and Nash and Simon and Garfunkel, and my wife loves Barbra Streisand, I then said, "Gee, I ought to have the music of all the groups that I represented over the years." So we represented the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band and Pure Prayer League, and we had a pretty strong in that sort of country rock, and Michael Murphy, who sang Wildfire, and Doug Kershaw, who was a Cajun, fiddler, and so all of those people are on my feed as well. But mainly the feed got built out by getting tired of hearing Simon and Garfunkel sing "Bridge Over Troubled Water." Although I was at Carnegie Hall the night that they sang it the first time, my friend's older sister took us. And so I said, who else sings Bridge Over Troubled Water? Oh, Aretha Franklin sings Bridge Over Troubled Water. Bob Dylan sang Bridge Over Troubled Water. Willie Nelson sang Bridge. So I have all of those
All the versions.
crazy
So,
versions of
so,
everything there.
so, obviously you did a lot of homework. You learned all about movie making. Did you have a mentor? Would you say there was somebody in the film business that when you were transitioning from being a lawyer to becoming a studio executive, did you have somebody who was a guiding presence in your life at all?
I would. It wasn't until my second job as an executive that I got my mentor. When I went to RKO, they were restarting the company. The son of the chairman of the company, Shane O'Neill, wanted to try and get the company back into the business. He happened to hire a client of mine to be the driving force of building that up. And I got my big break after they spent. Mark Seiler was his name. He died last summer. He was Morgan Fairchild was his wife of the last 30 odd years, and they met on the set of a movie that we were making at RKO, Campus Man. But Mark was looking for a big Hollywood uh, talent exec to come in and help him figure out what movies to make. And then there was a limited amount of money that we had at RKO. We had a mandate to make movies that cost up to $10 million, which was actually a reasonable amount of money back in 1984 when Mark went to RKO, but only 2.5 million of RKO's money could be at risk. So you had to figure out where the other 3/4 of the budget was coming from. And no established creative exec in Hollywood would leave their job where they knew where all the money was coming from to make the movies to move over to RKO. And I had grown from being a music lawyer initially into someone who represented a lot of companies in the independent financing of movies before indie films was a big thing. And I represented two video companies when home video was just starting to be a force in the business. I represented the biggest foreign sales company in the business, a company called PSO.
Sure,
And
sure.
they and
I know
yes,
them very well because they were behind the Jack Schwartzman brought the Bond movie to them.
exactly right. And I did the deal on that Jack Schwartzman Bond movie between him and PSO. I was PSO. That's where I got my big break and learned the businesses that I was doing so much work for PSO that after 2.5 years, they moved into our office building so that they could save money on my driving back and forth between their office. I went there virtually every day for half the day, and if I was in traffic, it would take me a half hour each way. And so they basically said they saved an hour's worth of attorney's fees every single day of the week by moving into our building. But they were my primary client. They were the key to my. I made partner in the law firm in 5 years. I was 28 when I was voted a partner in this august law firm. And it was wonderful. I was a fair-haired boy there. And a year and a half after I made partner, PSO offered me a job as president of PSO, and I turned that down um, because I thought that they were taking on more. They were an agent, and they took very little risk on the movies. They would buy the international rights uh, and sell them for a commission, and they already knew how much they could get pretty much for every territory outside the United States, and so they were financing 5, 6, 7 pictures a year, a portion of them by taking the foreign rights, and they were making 7, 8, $10 million a year profit with virtually no risk. But in as they got um, grew to be the biggest company in that area, they decided that they also wanted to commission their own films, not just sell other people's films. And they took significant risk. And I could see that they were going from making 8 to 10 million a year to losing the same amount. And so I turned down that opportunity. And a year later, Mark Seiler, having been unable to find the creative exec that he wanted to be the person to put the pieces together on the films at RKO, decided that between my connections to PSO and the video companies, and I represented tax shelter investors in Australia, in New Zealand, in Yugoslavia, and had a fair knowledge of how the tax system was beginning to work in Canada, that I could assemble the rest of the money. And that and I got the job along with Mark to be the one to pick the pictures. And they were able to justify it on the basis of, if I wasn't able to sell PSO on the foreign prospects of the movie, or I wasn't able to sell the video company on the commercial prospects of the movie, or I wasn't able to get these tax shelter investors who were sophisticated people who had come out of the film industry in Australia and New Zealand and Yugoslavia, if I couldn't get the money put together, then the movie wouldn't get made. And so my judgment would be checked by 2 or 3 or 4 sets of professionals as we assembled the budget. And so on that basis, they were ready to take a chance on somebody who had been around movies his whole life, had seen all the movies, had gone to all the production meetings at PSO, but had never been in a position. And there were producers, producers who were clients of ours, who came in and said, "Oh, Jerry, you're lucky. I'll make a 3-picture deal with you. And I've got 3 scripts here, and let's go make them." And I said, "Okay, well, can I read them?" Without mentioning any names, Marty. And he said, "What for?" And I said, "Because I have the job to decide which movies we get." And he said, "You, Jerry, you're gonna pick the movies? What do you know about picking movies?" I said, "I may not know that much, but if Mark Damon at PSO and John Hyde don't buy it, then it won't get made. But if they think that they can sell it," and Vestron, who was the biggest video company at the time, I had a deal with them, for whatever movies, and I made a deal with Paramount to have a first look at them as features, because we had represented, my senior partner and I had made Frank Mancuso, the chairman of Paramount Pictures, deal when we were lawyers. And so I went over there and I said, I'd like to, have a deal in place to get a certain amount of money from you on what I want to make. And Frank said yes, because he didn't have to do any movies, so he was willing to take a chance on my hustling around. And with those deals in place, if I couldn't get either PSO or Paramount or Vestron to invest in the movie, it wouldn't get made. But from the producer's point of view, me being the person who picked the pictures was offensive to him. So we never got that deal done. But
so being you and I are both huge baseball fans, and I always admired the movie 8 Men Out because it was such an interesting portrait of the Chicago Blackhawks scandal, the Black Sox scandal, not the Blackhawks, the Black Sox scandal. But given that people are always saying that U.S. baseball doesn't work overseas, was 8 Men Out a tough movie to get financed?
yeah, it was. And ultimately it came, I led a management buyout of RKO. I went there in 1985, and in 1986, for very reasons having to do with the parent company losing its broadcasting licenses, which was the main thing that they did with the RKO library. A year after I left my lifetime tenured job as a lawyer at Loeb and Loeb, they said they were going to close down the movie production after we had made like 5 movies. And So we went scrambling around, Mark Seiler and I, and it took us a year and a half. We ultimately bought the company, but in doing so, your Turner Classic Movies, it was largely built on the RKO library. Ted Turner bought the library from us, and his purchase of that library enabled us to buy the company from its parent, GenCorp, to buy RKO Pictures. But we no longer had the RKO library. We did have the remake rights to the films, but the films themselves went to Turner Classic. My name is on the December 7th, 1987, a day that will live in infamy for other reasons, but from our point of view as the management of RKO, having to sell the library was an infamous deed. And I am the person whose name sold the RKO library to Ted Turner. But 8 Men Out, we had finally figured out how to finance 8 Men Out. And then we were in the middle of the buyout, and the parent company said, no, 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 even if you've got it down to 2.5 million of investment, we're not investing in any more films. So then we had to turn around and find somebody to, we actually got that made by having Orion fully finance it. And we just became producers on it. Barbara Boyle, who was another partner of mine at RKO, and I are the exec producers of 8 Men Out. And I, having looked forward, being a huge baseball fan, having made 5 other baseball movies, once I got to Showtime, I never made it to the set of 8 Men Out because I was locked in a conference room with bankers and investment bankers and lawyers trying to buy the company. And Barbara went off to the set of 8 Men Out. But
was that shot in Canada, Jerry?
Where did we shoot 8 Men Out? I think we did shoot it in Canada.
Yeah.
I honestly, since I never made it there, I can't tell you. I can tell you about all the ones that I did make it to the set on.
Oh,
but
sure. So tell me, getting back to the question, tell me how you ended up on Showtime's doorstep.
So after we did our management buyout, we spent 2 years trying to recapitalize the company, trying to hire Ned Tannen, who was the chairman of Paramount Pictures, to come and work with Mark Seiler and myself at RKO. We had $100 million that was pledged to us by investors if we could get Ned Tannen to leave Paramount and come into business with us. They were not prepared, these investors, to trust me to pick the films, even though Hamburger Hill had been profitable and 8 Men Out had been well respected. They wanted a real studio and a big time deal. And what we succeeded in doing, and Mark really was the one that had the relationship with Ned, was more than doubling his contract to stay at Paramount Pictures, because he was able to dangle us out there saying, hey, these guys have $100 million for me to make movies, and I don't have to deal with all the crap at the studio or whatever. And they said, oh, Ned, how about 100% raise? So we never were able to get RKO then back into business, up and running. I got a couple of things done in the interim. We did Narrow Margin with Gene Hackman and Ann Archer, and which I have a producing credit on. So I started looking for other opportunities, and I got a call from perhaps the most important, or one of the 2 or 3 most important lawyers in the business, Ken Ziffren, one weekend, who said, ABC is going to be the first network to go back into the production business. And the government had kept the networks for 25 years by virtue of a consent decree from owning any of their programming. And they need somebody and they're going to take Brandon Stoddard, who was the creative head of ABC Entertainment, and put him in charge of their production operation to show how seriously they're going to take this foray into making and owning some of their own programming. And at that point in time, the government had said all you could own was 25% of the schedule. And they were looking for somebody to be Brandon's partner, who was a good businessman, who could figure out, you know, how to get things done. Uh, and and I was not, you know, I had done some television work as a lawyer. I hadn't done any in 5 years while I was at RKO. And Kenny said, we're going to be like the Dallas Cowboys. You don't have to know how to play the position. You just have to be the best athlete available on the draft board. And I think that you would be a good partner for Brandon. And Kenny and I had gotten to know each other because as I was fading out of being a lawyer, he pretty much took over the PSO business at his firm. And so we had a lot of conversations with each other. And so he sent me off to meet Brandon Stoddard. I walked into Brandon's office because they had started tentatively to build this company out, and got immediately intimidated because lining the side of Brandon's books stacked up were all the miniseries he had made: Roots, Winds of War, War and Remembrance, The Thornbirds, i.e., 9 of the 10 highest rated miniseries that had ever been made had been greenlit by this guy sitting behind his desk. You know, he was about 6 inches shorter than I was. He was gray. He was very patricianly, you know, very classy, very, you know, most beautiful cashmere sweaters in the world on. And what turned out to be also the greatest creative mind I've ever been in the room with. And what came out of, I spent 4 years at ABC Productions, and what came out of that was the equivalent of 2 PhDs in television. One administered by Ken Zifrin, the greatest deal maker that I've ever had the pleasure to, you know, be in the room with. Kenny single-handedly settled the, not this past writer's strike, but the one before that. Those writers would never have gone back to work if Kenny hadn't come up with a creative way to make that deal. And one in the creative side from Brandon Stoddard, because every script that came in from every writer, I would spend some time the next day talking to Brandon Stoddard about it and why, you know, where did, if something wasn't right, where did it go wrong? And sometimes I would say, well, on page 70, they did X and Y on one of our movie scripts. And Brandon would say, no, they went wrong at page 40 because they boxed them. What happened at page 70 had to happen, you know, because of the choice they made at page 40. And so we need to go back further and unravel the thread of this film earlier on. And it was just, you know, you spend 2 hours a day pretty much alone, just talking one-on-one with a genius. And then on the business side of running the company, and we made, before I left, we had done 9 series and 20 movies. You know, we made An Inconvenient Woman, which was based on a Dominic Dunn book, and it was nominated for Best Miniseries. We made Broadway Bound, Neil Simon's Broadway Bound, and with Sam Bancroft, who we worked with 2 more times at Showtime, and with Hume Cronin, who I got to spend the entire afternoon when I visited the set of Broadway Bound with Hume Cronin, and it created a friendship and a mentorship that lasted all through Showtime. You did 5 movies for us at Showtime.
Yeah. I warmly remember him working on a movie called Alone, where he was absolutely wonderful. I have a bunch of letters from him. It couldn't have been a nicer guy. It's hard to
Yeah.
believe that the guy who played the warden in Brute Force, this horrible warden, one of the great noir roles, is this sweet little man that couldn't have been the nicer guy, etc. So who recruited you for Showtime? Was it Matt Blank?
Yes. Uh-huh. it was Matt Blank. I owe Matt a tremendous debt of gratitude because for 10 years I had the greatest job in Hollywood. I got to pretty much nobody second guessed our choices of the movies. The only ones that Matt ever intervened on were the ones where we were likely to potentially get the network in trouble because the subject matter was controversial. We had more involvement of the whole management team in what series got ordered because that was an ongoing commitment. But I sold Matt and the company in a several months of lobbying and putting together a presentation deck of about 80 pages on the fact that instead of making one or two pictures a year and 6 episodes of Fallen Angels, that with not too much more money, because of putting the pieces together like I had done at RKO, that we could dramatically increase the amount of original programming on Showtime, and particularly the amount of movies that were on Showtime, because they had values to other end users besides ourselves. And so we could sell the international rights, we could sell the video rights, we could sell the television syndication rights, we could make them in places where we got tax shelter subsidies, and we could, significantly net our costs down, which would enable us to increase the volume. And in fact, I sold them on the premise of an original movie every week.
Well, it's interesting. This whole concept, this world of doing original movies for premium cable. Obviously, HBO had done some fairly high-profile movies as well. Has that all gone away, Jerry? It seems to me that long ago, Showtime got out of the movie business.
Yes.
Was it because those areas that supported your concept dried up?
No, Showtime got out of the business long before they dried up. You couldn't do what I did now. Now you couldn't do what we did then. The video values disappeared when streaming came along. The international values went down substantially. When I started this concept at Showtime, there were, the three networks had 4 movie nights on. There were 30 something, they made 30 something movies a year on, and they were mostly on Sunday night. And HBO was making 10 or 12 films a year at that time. And we went out and did, in our biggest year, which I think is probably 1997, we did 36 movies for Showtime and 25 movies for the Movie Channel. And and in the 10 years we did 300 of them. 285 or 280 of them commissioned by us, and 15 or 20 of them things that we saw at a film festival or at Cannes or somewhere, and we said, you know what, this would be a good fit for us, and we were able to make a deal on it and just buy the Showtime rights. So we worked backwards from our original model, which is we greenlit it, and then we found people to lay off the cost on. But sometimes there were people who were looking for a home for a film in the United States, and we became that home. And we could never have gotten those 300 films done without Robbie Halmy Jr., whose dad was probably, say that Brandon Stoddard is the greatest figure in long form television, because he was, as I mentioned, those 9 highest rated miniseries on his desk, and he and Barry Diller started the movie of the week on ABC, and he was in charge of the movies of the week there for 12, 15 years before he became the head of the whole network. But the next most important name probably in long form television was Robert Halmy the Senior, who went out and did, all these epic, $30 million miniseries when nobody else could figure out how to finance 12 or 13 of them. But for us at Showtime, they're doing that at Hallmark became a fantastic opportunity because we were the boxcars behind their locomotives. They had phenomenal access to sell their miniseries around the world. Every network in every country was competing to buy, Merlin or the sequel to Gone with the Wind or Gulliver's Travels, or with big talent in these things. And because they had the entree, they could say to them, okay, we'll agree on the price for this big 2 miniseries we're going to sell you this year, but you have to buy 20 other movies from us. And since the networks overseas had movie nights to fill up, they bought those movies, and our movies therefore became the bulk that went behind those giant miniseries that the Halmies did. And that was, orchestrated by Robbie Halmy, who's the best business partner I ever had. And we did 150 of our 300 movies with them, some of which we took from them, maybe half a dozen, and the rest came from us to them.
I threw up a picture here from Hiroshima, which I had the opportunity to work on in the marketing.
And that's where the relationship with the Halmy started. That is the exact reason that I brought it up at this point, because we were sitting there in January of 1995 with a brilliant script written in both English and Japanese to be shot in both English and Japanese, which was a very innovative concept, the kind of thing that could distinguish us from the rest of the pack. And we didn't have the money. We knew that we could get part of it out of Canada in a tax deal. I actually went to Don Ohlmeyer at NBC, who agreed to do something that had never been done before and take a second run on the network after ours. And he contributed $2.5 million to that. And we were still short, but we also still had all the rights in the rest of the world, except for Canada, available. And Robbie Halmy said, oh, wow, this is even better than the rest of the movies you're making. This actually fits in with my father's miniseries. And this is an epic event. And the 50th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb was that August. And to us, that if we couldn't make that date, we weren't going to do it at all. If we couldn't get the added publicity, the added swell of attention, the get off of the entertainment pages and get into the news pages where everybody in every newspaper was going to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the dropping of the bomb. How did we know that was going to happen? You paid enough attention, but also my mentor, Brandon Stoddard, even though I was gone from ABC for a year at that point, on every tough call for the next 10 years as to what I should do. Should I buy Lolita, that all the studios passed on, and premiere it on Showtime? Should we buy back Angelica Houston's Bastard Out of Carolina, which we developed but didn't make because we couldn't get a big enough star to be in the movie? And so she got Ted Turner to make the movie, and then he wouldn't air it because it was such difficult subject matter. And now it had a groundswell of publicity about it, so we bought it back. For all of those things, and to prepare me for my dialogues with Matt Blank about those things, I called up Brandon Stoddard, and Brandon had done The Day After on ABC. It was hugely controversial. It was extremely lucrative for the network when he did it, because the controversy enabled them to sell it for much more money than they otherwise would have been able to sell it for. So, I talked to Brandon about Hiroshima, and he said, yeah, as long as you can get it on for the anniversary. Well, now you think, how long does it take to shoot a 3-hour miniseries. Okay, if you rush it, you could shoot it in about 9 weeks. And how long does it take to prep it? Well, if you rush it, you could prep it in 6 weeks. That's 15 weeks. And how long does it normally take to edit it? Well, normally it takes about 15 weeks to edit it. But if you rush it, you can get it done in about 8 weeks. And let's see, that's 23 weeks by rushing everything. And we were 24 weeks away from the deadline, the anniversary date. And I went into Robbie Halmey's office in New York to meet him. Never met the guy before. Steve Hewitt, who was working with us, a great creative exec, brought me in to meet him. And Steve was well acquainted with Robbie's dad, and had great respect for him. And in the room, Robbie bought Hiroshima, which enabled us to greenlight Hiroshima, and he bought 20 other of the movies that we had made. And that was good because we had 2 deals for those 20 movies, 10 and 10, and the people we had them with had reneged within the 60 days beforehand. And if we hadn't found Robbie Halmey, I would have had a very interesting 1.5 years at Showtime instead of the 10 years I ultimately, you
Well,
know,
I I remember at the beginning of our conversation tonight, you were talking about when you first started out as a lawyer, you wanted to be a crusader. And it's interesting, there were a number of titles you brought to Showtime that fall into the crusading point of view. I put up a picture of Ted Danson because he was in another film I worked on the campaign for called Thanks of a Grateful Nation, which exposed the true horrors of the Gulf War, not combat horrors, but the toxic horrors that affected our servicemen. That miniseries must have given you a lot of gratification.
it did. It did. The most emotional, I went up to Canada when they were shooting that, and I happened to be there on the night when Steven Weber, who had gone off to the Gulf War to basically cap oil wells. He wasn't a soldier. He was an oil field guy. And he came back and he didn't know what was wrong with him, and he was debilitated, and he was not married. And so his sister, played by Marg Helgenberg, who in the early days did 3 or 4 things for us, his sister was taking care of him. And I was there the night they shot his death scene. And it was 8 degrees in Toronto that night. And I'm standing there with John Sacred Young, who had created and won a number of Emmys for China Beach, and Rod Holcomb, who'd won a number of Emmys for directing China Beach, who was directing Thanks for Grateful Nation, and Joan Borstein, who was our exec on it. And we're wearing 2 parkas, all of us, because the scene was to carry him outside and have his friends gather in a circle around him with this music playing, and it's the single most powerful experience I've ever had on a film set. And every single person there was crying, but their tears were freezing on their face.
Wow.
For any place that they're, and it was, and for the Pentagon fought for a number of years to say there was no such thing as Gulf War syndrome. And Andy Adelson, who had had to deal with us at ABC during the 4 years that I was there, had developed this script with us at Showtime. And it took John Young a while to get it done because he was not a person to be rushed, but one of the greatest writing talents I ever worked with. I knew him from ABC as well, and he was a protege of Brandon Stoddard's, which, Brandon vouched for me. That meant I was good in John Young's book, and I very much admired him. And we did. He just wrote a magnificent script, and it was. If you ask me the single thing that I made that I'm most proud of, I would say it's Thanks for Grateful Nation, because it it chronicled the ups and downs of the struggle. Senator Don Regal of Michigan is dragged in by the guy who worked for him in his office, who was a Vietnam vet and really didn't want to deal with the trials and tribulations of veterans because he had his own scars to deal with. But ultimately, he did go to his senator. He did get him to back the bill. You know, the movie ends on an unpleasant note, the miniseries, because the money that had been agreed in committee to be committed to investigating Gulf War syndrome gets dramatically cut at the end of the movie. And it's just a sort of drop in the ocean of what they needed. It was better than nothing, but not really that much better than nothing. And but the Pentagon was so serious about denying the fact that there was any such thing as Gulf War syndrome that, you know, they sent Colin Powell, who was still, you know, there, the Joint Chiefs out to stand in front of the Pentagon on the weekend that we aired it and said, there is no such thing as Gulf War syndrome, which turned out to be certainly one of the times that General Powell was mistaken. And 4 or 5 years later, I did take some satisfaction, and I did get about 30 phone calls from people when Congress appropriated $500 million to take care of the veterans who had suffered from Gulf War syndrome. I would say it was about a decade too late, but it was something that I think all of us who worked on it were rightly proud of.
Well, we're coming to the end of the show, but before we end, I definitely wanted to bring up one of my favorite shows.
Can I come back for another show? Because we haven't even scratched the surface yet.
We are going to do a thank you. I'm glad you said that, Jerry, because I agree. We literally have touched a sliver of this. I would love to do a part 2 with you. Thank you. And we will reserve the time to talk about shows like 12 Angry Men next time. Absolutely. We have been listening.
12 Angry Men, just as a teaser for the audience for the next time, we had 7 Oscar-nominated actors in that cast. We had one unknown who snuck his way in, who turned out to be Gandolfini, who went on to some greater acclaim after that. But, you know, Jack Lemmon and George C. Scott had never worked together before. They loved working together so much that we got to do Inherit the Wind with the two of them after that. So a lot of great good came out of 12 Angry Men, including it being one of the 2 or 3 things that got us the respect of the industry that we were hoping to get by going into making these kinds of films. And, you know, there's a lot of unusual things about 12 Angry Men and Billy Friedkin and, you know, a fantastic talent who died not too long ago. And, you know, a lot of the people here, Courtney Vance, who played the foreman, you know, got his SAG card on Hamburger Hill. You know? And
well, I don't know if you realize this, but the Publicists Guild of America that year, I was nominated for Best Publicity Campaign with our PR team.
Well, well deserved, because
absolutely.
Everybody knew that 12 Angry Men was there, and it got nominated for 7 Emmys, if I recall correctly, including Best Movie. And, you know, when we went out and said that we were going to make a movie every week, and, you know, I still have the articles from the very skeptical articles from both the Variety and the Hollywood Reporter and the international film journals as well, where they said, you know, if we would never do it. We would never figure out how to make those movies. We'd never figure out how to pay for them. We couldn't find enough material that was good. If we did make them, they wouldn't be good, because how could you possibly make good films on the budgets that we were talking about? You'll never get the talent to cut their prices. Every one of these gentlemen behind your head worked for $100,000 a week for the movie. Every one of them cut their price to $100,000. And I mentioned before that Hume Cronin became a mentor to me and close. And he pulled me to the side. This is the first thing he did for us at Showtime. He pulled me to the side. He said, Jerry, Jack and George aren't getting a crummy $100,000 like I am. Come on, tell the truth. You would not lie to me. And I said, you're right. I would not lie to you. Everybody's making $100,000, and that led to other people cutting their prices. And um, we did Kevin Bacon's directing debut, Losing Chase, and Helen Mirren and Beau Bridges, and of course Kira cut her price to $100,000 to help her husband get his directing debut. But Helen Mirren and Beau Bridges did it also because of how good the material was, and it ultimately was nominated for the Golden Globe for Best Film, and Helen won for Best Actress. And so, we were running a clinic on what you could do with limited resources and still make quality pictures. And I'll end this by saying that we're very proud of the 70 plus Emmy nominated films that we made, and the 2 Oscar nominated films that we made, the most prominently Gods and Monsters. And it was a great run while it lasted. And it was an honor and a privilege. And I got a lot of the credit for the terrific work done by an incredibly talented staff, particularly Gary Levine and Mark Zachrin and Ann Foley, and their teams of people.
Well, I mean, I definitely want to get into the weeds in our next time we get together, because you're absolutely right. We can't squeeze this into one show. And I think the listeners who are listening, and they're getting a bit of a primer on what you could actually do in this business if you put the right resources together. And again, as an independent film producer, I really miss those days, because you provided so many opportunities, and you gave me my producing debut with Bleacher Bums, and I'll never forget that. But
one of the baseball movies.
One of the baseball movies.
So Steve, when my wife, who is not a baseball fan, and to some extent she's a fan of my work, but we went to Cooperstown. One of the big mistakes I made was going with her instead of my 3 sons who were rabid Yankee fans. And but we were on a road trip, and we went to Cooperstown, and the only thing she was excited about was that right outside where the Penny Marshall movie, A League of Their Own, there was at that time, I don't know if it's still there, a giant permanent League of Our Own exhibition. And next to it, it had a list of 65 baseball movies. And I can honestly say with pride that I'm certain that I was the league leader in that, because 6 of them, including, of course, 8 Men Out and Bleacher Bums, and Curveballs Away, the Joe Torre biopic, and the one that Frankie and Hazel at Barbra Streisand executive produced. They were all there, and so after that, she then went out shopping on Main Street in Cooperstown, and I continued on. And someday I'll get back there and really fully enjoy the museum. But it was fun to see that list of all these baseball movies and say, oh, I made that one. We made that one. We made that one.
Well, we have been listening to the wonderful Jerry Offsay talk about his career and the beginnings of Showtime, which we will continue on our next show. You've been listening to Saturday Night at the Movies. I'm your host, Steve Rubin. Our producer's Ben Shrewsbury. Jerry, thank you so much for taking...
Steve, when are you going to put this out into the world?
This will be on the air. Let's see. Today is Tuesday. It'll be on the air next Monday.
Wow. Okay.
And I will send you
a fast turnaround.
It's a fast turnaround. I will send you a link. Let me just end the show right now. Hang on one second.